People like you shouldn't even be touching money, Daniel Whitmore said, his voice cutting clean through the low hum of scanners and shopping carts, sharp enough that even the automatic doors seemed to hesitate mid-slide. And for a brief second, the entire front end of the store felt like it had inhaled and forgotten how to breathe. While Marcus Reed stood behind register lane 6 with his hands resting lightly on the edge of the counter, the barcode scanner still warm beneath his fingers, its red beam flickering across a carton of eggs that no one had asked him to scan yet, his name tag slightly tilted against his dark green uniform, the fluorescent lights above reflecting off the polished tile floor in long, pale streaks that stretched toward the glass entrance where a few customers had just stepped in, only to slow down as they sensed something in the air, something off, something heavier than a simple transaction gone wrong. And Marcus didn't respond right away, not because he hadn't heard the words, but because he had, every syllable landing with the same dull familiarity he'd carried for years, the kind of words that didn't shock anymore, just settled somewhere quiet behind the ribs, while Daniel adjusted the cuff of his tailored jacket, a small, impatient gesture that spoke of someone used to being accommodated without question, his leather wallet still open in his hand, a platinum card half visible between his fingers as if it were proof of something more than just payment. And the line behind him shifted uneasily, a mother pulling her young son a little closer to her side, the boy glancing up at Marcus with wide, uncertain eyes, as if trying to understand why a man who looked so calm was being spoken to like that. And Marcus finally moved, not away, not defensive, just forward enough to gently slide the carton of eggs aside and straighten the small stack of receipts near the register. His voice, when it came low and even, measured in a way that didn't rise to meet the tension. "Sir, I just need a moment to verify the card," he said, simple, professional, the kind of sentence that belonged to routine, not conflict. But Daniel let out a short, humorless laugh, loud enough to draw the attention of the cashier 2 lanes over, who paused mid-scan, her hand hovering above a box of cereal. And somewhere near the back of the store, a price check announcement started and then abruptly cut off, like someone had pressed the wrong button, while Marcus's screen blinked quietly in front of him, a small notification pulsing in the corner that reflected faintly in his eyes, steady, focused, unreadable, as the overhead lights hummed softly and the conveyor belt stood still between them. A thin line dividing 2 men who occupied the same space, but lived in entirely different worlds, and Daniel leaned slightly closer over the counter, lowering his voice just enough to make it feel more personal, more deliberate. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he added, tapping the card once against the counter, the sound crisp and controlled, and Marcus nodded once, not submissive, not defiant, just acknowledging, as if the moment were nothing more than another item to be processed, another line to move forward, while the store, still and watchful, waited for something to happen, something to break the quiet that had settled like glass over everything, thin, fragile, and ready to shatter. Marcus Reed had learned a long time ago that silence could be heavier than words, and standing there behind register lane 6, he carried that silence the way some people carried weight on their shoulders, steady and practiced, as if it had become part of the uniform he wore every day, because this job was never just about scanning items or making change. It was about showing up, about keeping things moving, about making sure that no matter who stepped up to his counter, they left with what they needed. And sometimes that meant swallowing moments like this without letting them spill over into something bigger, something that would cost more than just a few uncomfortable seconds. While his eyes remained on the screen, carefully navigating the payment prompt, his fingers moving with quiet precision, each tap deliberate, each motion controlled, and behind that calm exterior was a rhythm built from years of responsibility. Early mornings and late nights, the kind that came from growing up in a small apartment just a few miles away where the air conditioning rattled in the summer and the heating clicked unevenly in the winter, where his younger sister would sit at the kitchen table with her school books spread out, waiting for him to come home so he could help her with homework before his next shift. And that was always the thing that grounded him. The reason he stayed steady when everything around him tried to pull him off balance. Because for Marcus, this was never just a job. It was a bridge, a way forward, a way to make sure that someone else had a little more than he did growing up. And the customers who came through his line every day, most of them never knew that. They saw the uniform, the name tag, the quiet voice, but they did not see the hours, the discipline, the choices made when no one was watching, and Marcus preferred it that way, because there was a certain kind of strength in being unseen, in doing things right without needing recognition. And even now, as Daniel Whitmore stood in front of him radiating impatience, tapping his card again with a sharper edge, Marcus did not match that energy. He did not rise to meet it. Instead, he stayed anchored, his breathing slow, his posture relaxed but attentive, while a faint reflection of the overhead lights shimmered across the register screen, casting a soft glow across his face. And somewhere behind him, a refrigerator unit hummed steadily, the sound blending into the quiet tension that still lingered in the air. And Marcus reached for the card terminal, lifting it slightly to adjust the angle, making sure the connection was secure, because even in moments like this, details mattered, professionalism mattered, and more than anything, control mattered. Not control over the situation, but control over himself, because he understood something that Daniel did not, something that could not be bought or demanded. That respect did not come from how loudly someone spoke or how much power they believed they had. It came from how they carried themselves when no one was offering it freely. And Marcus carried himself the same way every time, calm, grounded, unshaken, as if the storm in front of him was nothing more than passing weather, and the line behind Daniel remained still, the people waiting no longer shifting or whispering, just watching, as if they could feel that something deeper than a simple transaction was unfolding in that narrow space between the counter and the card, something quiet but undeniable, something that had not yet revealed itself, but was already beginning to change the air. Daniel Whitmore was not used to waiting, and it showed in the way his posture tightened with every passing second, in the way his fingers tapped against the counter with a rhythm that carried more impatience than the sound itself suggested, because to him, time had always been something he controlled, something he bought, scheduled, and demanded from others without question. And standing in a grocery store line, held in place by a cashier who did not immediately bend to his pace, felt like a disruption he had no tolerance for, while the subtle details around him only sharpened that discomfort. The soft hum of refrigeration units, the distant beeping of another register restarting its cycle, the faint squeak of a cart while turning somewhere behind him, all of it continuing as if the world had not paused for him. And that, more than anything, seemed to unsettle him, because Daniel lived in a world where things moved when he expected them to move, where people responded before he needed to ask twice, and where his presence alone often shifted the tone of a room. But here, in this narrow checkout lane under bright fluorescent lights, that expectation was not being met, and it created a tension that he did not know how to navigate without pushing harder. So he leaned slightly forward again, his voice sharpening just enough to cut through the quiet without raising it into a scene that would reflect poorly on him. "Is there a problem, or are we just standing here all day?" he said, each word measured but edged, while Marcus remained focused on the terminal, the small screen reflecting lines of text that flickered between authorization prompts and verification notices, his expression unchanged, his attention steady, as if the pressure in front of him was no more significant than a routine delay, and that calm only seemed to deepen the imbalance between them. Because where Daniel expected resistance or apology, he found neither, just a quiet consistency that did not bend. And behind them, the line had grown still in a different way now, no longer just curious, but attentive, as if everyone present could sense that something was building beneath the surface, something not loud or explosive, but precise, controlled, and inevitable. While a store employee near the self-checkout area glanced over and then quickly looked away, unsure whether to intervene or stay out of it. And near the entrance, a woman paused with her reusable bag still hanging from her shoulder, watching without moving, her gaze shifting between Marcus and Daniel as if trying to read a story that had not yet reached its turning point. And Daniel exhaled through his nose, a small sign of irritation that he did not bother to hide, adjusting his stance as if reclaiming space that had never been taken from him. Because to him, this moment was simple, a transaction delayed by someone who did not understand urgency, someone who did not recognize who he was or what his time was worth, and that assumption settled into his expression, subtle but clear, while Marcus finally lifted his eyes from the screen, not abruptly, not confrontationally, just enough to meet the space in front of him with quiet acknowledgement, his voice even, respectful, but firm in a way that did not ask for permission. "The system flagged something, sir. I just need a few more seconds to clear it," he said. And there was no hesitation in his tone, no uncertainty, just a calm explanation delivered with the same steadiness he had carried from the beginning. And for a brief moment, the space between them felt like it stretched, not physically, but in weight, as if something unseen had settled there, something that neither of them named, but both could feel, and the store, still wrapped in that thin layer of silence, seemed to lean into it, waiting. Marcus did not rush, and that was the first thing that truly disrupted Daniel's sense of control, because in a world where everything responded to urgency, where delays were fixed with a phone call or a raised voice, Marcus's refusal to accelerate felt less like a technical issue and more like a quiet boundary being drawn, one that Daniel could not simply step over. And as the seconds stretched, Marcus reached toward the register keypad and entered a secondary verification code, his fingers steady, deliberate, the soft clicks of each button sounding louder than they should in the suspended stillness around them. While the small screen refreshed again, a brief flicker of white light reflecting across his eyes before settling into a new prompt, and Marcus tilted the card terminal slightly, aligning it more precisely with the connection port, ensuring that nothing was left to chance. Because if there was one thing he had learned working this counter, it was that small details could carry larger consequences, and behind him, the conveyor belt remained unmoving, a single loaf of bread and a gallon of milk sitting untouched, their presence almost symbolic now, items caught in the middle of something that had moved beyond a simple purchase, while Daniel shifted his weight again, his patience thinning in a way that showed through the tightening of his jaw, the subtle narrowing of his eyes, as if he were recalibrating how much pressure to apply next. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a sharper edge, no longer masked by politeness. "You are making this more complicated than it needs to be," he said, his tone no longer just impatient, but dismissive, as if the delay itself were evidence of incompetence rather than procedure, and Marcus lifted his gaze just enough to acknowledge him again. Not defensive, not apologetic, simply present. "I understand it is taking longer than expected, sir, but I need to follow the system protocol," he replied, his words calm, precise, leaving no space for argument while also offering no confrontation. And that balance, that quiet firmness, seemed to create a different kind of tension, one that did not escalate outward but pressed inward, tightening the atmosphere around them like a held breath, while a soft murmur rippled briefly through the line behind Daniel before fading just as quickly, people unsure whether to speak or remain silent, their attention fixed on the exchange as if they were witnessing something more than just a delay, something that had weight beyond the moment. And near the end of the aisle, a store associate paused mid-step, watching from a distance with a concerned expression, her hands clasped lightly in front of her as if she were ready to step in but unsure if she should, while Marcus's screen finally displayed a confirmation window, a line of text indicating that manual authorization was required, and he reached for the small handheld device beneath the counter, lifting it with care, its surface cool and smooth against his palm, as he initiated the next step without hesitation, because this was the part most cashiers tried to avoid, the part that took time, that invited scrutiny. But Marcus did not skip steps, he did not cut corners, and as he held the device steady, waiting for the connection to finalize, the silence in the store deepened in a way that felt almost tangible, like the air itself had thickened, and Daniel, standing there in his pressed jacket and polished shoes, found himself in a position he rarely experienced, one where control was not immediate, where authority was not unquestioned, and where the outcome of the moment was no longer entirely in his hands. And that realization, subtle but undeniable, settled into the space between them, waiting for what would come next. The handheld device in Marcus's hand emitted a soft, confirming tone, not loud, but distinct enough to draw every remaining thread of attention toward the counter. And for a brief second, no one moved, as if the sound itself had sealed the moment in place. While Marcus glanced down at the screen, reading the small block of text that had just appeared, his expression unchanged but his focus sharpened. Because this was no longer a routine delay, this was a flagged transaction that required accountability, and he knew exactly what that meant, even if the man standing in front of him did not yet realize it. And Daniel let out a quiet scoff, shifting his stance again, his patience now fully worn thin. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice no longer restrained, no longer softened by public awareness. "I do not have time for this kind of incompetence." And the word hung in the air longer than it should have, heavier than the situation warranted, but Marcus did not react to it, not outwardly. Instead, he placed the handheld device gently on the counter and straightened slightly, his posture still relaxed but now carrying a subtle firmness, the kind that did not ask for agreement, only acknowledgement. "Sir, the system requires an additional verification step before I can proceed," he said, his tone steady, respectful, but no longer accommodating in the way Daniel expected, and that shift, small as it was, seemed to unsettle the balance even further because Daniel was not being challenged directly, but he was also not being yielded to, and that was unfamiliar territory for him. And behind him, the line had gone completely still now, no carts rolling, no quiet conversations, just the faint hum of the store's lighting system and the distant automatic doors opening and closing somewhere near the entrance, while a man near the back of the line lowered his phone slightly, as if he had been considering recording but now was unsure if he should, and a woman near the magazines turned her body just enough to get a clearer view, her expression no longer curious but intent, as if she understood that something significant was unfolding in the smallest of ways. And Daniel exhaled sharply, running a hand briefly over his wrist as if to check the time without looking at his watch, a gesture of someone who measured minutes in value, not patience. And when he spoke again, there was no attempt to hide the irritation. "Then get your manager," he said, his voice firm, decisive, the kind of instruction he was used to giving and having followed immediately. And Marcus did not hesitate, but he also did not rush. He simply nodded once, acknowledging the request without changing his pace, and reached toward the small button beneath the counter that signaled for assistance, his movement controlled, unhurried, as if the outcome did not depend on speed but on process. And as he pressed it, a soft chime echoed faintly from somewhere behind the store, subtle but noticeable, and the moment that followed felt heavier than anything before it, because now the situation had crossed a line from private exchange to shared attention, from transaction to evaluation, and Daniel stood there, shoulders squared, gaze forward, expecting resolution, expecting correction, expecting the system to realign itself in his favor, while Marcus returned his attention to the register, waiting, composed, as if he already understood something that had not yet been revealed, and the store, wrapped in that same fragile silence, seemed to lean in even closer, holding the space between them as if it knew that whatever came next would not just resolve the moment, but redefine it. The soft chime from the assistant's call faded into the background, and what followed was not immediate movement, not urgency, but a pause that seemed to stretch longer than it should have, as if even the store itself was waiting before allowing the next step to unfold, while Marcus stood exactly where he had been, his hands resting lightly near the register, his shoulders relaxed, his breathing even, the kind of stillness that did not come from hesitation but from certainty. And the fluorescent lights above cast a steady glow across the counter, reflecting faintly off the card terminal and the polished surface of the conveyor belt, where the untouched items remained exactly as they were, frozen in place like markers of a moment that had yet to resolve. And Daniel shifted again, though this time the movement carried less confidence and more restlessness, a subtle shift in weight, a glance toward the aisle, as if expecting someone to appear immediately, to restore the balance he believed had been disrupted, and yet no one came. Right away, and that delay, small as it was, began to settle into the space around him in a way that felt unfamiliar, because he was not used to waiting without acknowledgement, not used to standing in a place where his presence did not immediately command response. And the line behind him remained quiet, not out of indifference, but out of attention, a collective awareness that something was unfolding in layers too subtle to interrupt, while a faint sound of footsteps echoed from the far end of the store, distant at first, then gradually more defined, measured and unhurried, each step carrying a sense of purpose that contrasted with the tension at the counter. And Marcus did not turn toward it, did not break his focus, as if he already knew who was coming, as if the next part of the moment had already been accounted for in his mind. While Daniel finally glanced over his shoulder, his expression tightening slightly as he registered the approaching figure, though he could not yet make out who it was, and the seconds between each step seemed to lengthen, not because of time itself, but because of the weight placed upon it by expectation, and the store remained suspended in that fragile quiet, the kind where even small sounds felt amplified, the distant hum of refrigeration, the faint click of a cart while turning somewhere out of sight, the automatic doors opening with a soft mechanical sigh and closing again, letting in a brief wash of afternoon light that stretched across the floor before fading. And in that stillness, Marcus allowed himself a single slow breath, not visible, not emphasized, just enough to ground himself further, to remain exactly as he had been from the start, composed, steady, present, while Daniel's hand hovered briefly near the counter, as if considering another gesture, another statement, something to reclaim control of the moment. But nothing came, because something had shifted, not dramatically, not outwardly, but enough that even he could feel it, a subtle change in the balance of the space, as if the situation no longer belonged entirely to him. And then the footsteps reached the edge of the aisle, stopping just short of the register, and though no words had yet been spoken, the presence alone altered the atmosphere, deepening the silence rather than breaking it. And for the first time since the moment began, Daniel did not speak, did not move, but simply stood there, waiting, as the next part of the story prepared to reveal itself. The figure who stepped into the edge of the lane did not rush, did not announce themselves with authority or urgency, but their presence carried something quieter and far more definitive, the kind of weight that did not need to be explained to be understood. And as they came fully into view beneath the fluorescent lights, it became clear to anyone watching that this was not just another employee responding to a call button, but someone who moved through the store with familiarity, with ownership of the space that extended beyond a uniform or a title badge. And Olivia Bennett stopped just beside the register, her posture composed, her expression neutral but attentive, her eyes moving first to Marcus, not to Daniel. And that small detail, that order of attention, shifted something immediately, almost imperceptibly, but enough that the silence tightened rather than eased, and Marcus met her gaze briefly, a quiet acknowledgement passing between them that did not need words, while Daniel straightened slightly, as if preparing to reclaim the moment now that someone with authority had arrived, his voice ready before she even spoke. "I have been waiting for an unreasonable amount of time," he began, his tone measured but edged with expectation. "And your cashier is making this unnecessarily complicated." But Olivia did not interrupt him. She did not nod in agreement or disagreement. She simply listened for a brief moment before shifting her attention back to Marcus, her voice calm, controlled. "What do we have?" she asked, and Marcus responded with the same steadiness he had maintained from the beginning. "The system flagged the transaction for manual verification. I initiated the process and requested assistance as required," he said, concise, factual, without embellishment, and Olivia gave a small